McGhee. Heather McGhee is the director of the Washington office of DEMOS, a research and policy center that was founded in 2000. DEMOS is a nonpartisan organization focusing on fostering a vibrant and inclusive democracy, an equitable economy, a public sector empowered to act for the common good, and a responsible U.S. engagement in the world. It's not a lot, just, they pick and choose. It is distinguished by its research and advocacy at the federal and state levels. And I think we're going to be talking more today about its advocacy also at the local level as it can apply to some of the local impact that Betsy was talking about. Heather develops and executes strategy for increasing the organization's impact on federal policy debates in Washington. Previously, she was Deputy Policy Director, Domestic and Economic Policy for the John Edwards for President campaign in 2008, and a Program Associate in DEMOS Economic Opportunity Program. Among Heather's areas of expertise are economy and opportunity, financial reform, jobs and public investment, credit and debt, and inequality. So again, very, very narrow, if you can really start to see it the way it sounds to me. Her writing and research on debt, financial services regulation, retirement, and inequality have appeared in numerous outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Detroit Free Press, and CNN. She's the co-author of a chapter on retirement insecurity in a book called Inequality Matters. Ms. McGhee holds a BA in American Studies from Yale, you may have heard of that school down the road, and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley. So please welcome the Connecticut Housing Coalition, Heather McGhee.
Wow. You all are beautiful from up here. This is great. Actually, can you just give yourselves a round of applause for being here today and for the work that you do every day? This is marvelous. I really want to thank Betsy, who invited me to be here today, who saw some videos on YouTube, I think, and read some writing and said, we'll take a risk on her. So I hope that you find that it wasn't too much of a risk. Betsy got to know my organization, DEMOS, through our president, who sends his warmest regards. Our president is Miles Rappaport, who was a Connecticut state legislator and the Secretary of State in Connecticut, and who loves Connecticut housing so much that he still, in fact, lives here, even though we are headquartered in New York. As was mentioned, DEMOS works to achieve some really broad goals around democratic equality and around economic inequality, which we see as inevitably intertwined. And we also see that the role of the public sector in sound public policy is what can make economic inequality real and what requires a more robust democracy where average people and working class families actually have more agency over the decisions that affect their lives. So we try to achieve those very broad goals in many ways. We do the regular think tank stuff. We release reports, we crunch numbers, we go on TV and go on the shout fests and try to shout our way towards some kind of common sense. But we also, and this is what I think sets DEMOS apart, we really work with on-the-ground advocates in all 50 states to help connect the pressing public issues that are animating their everyday work to the larger national policy debates, and to really offer training and assistance and resources to state and local organizations and people. So it's exactly fitting that I should be here today talking to you about housing, which is a core issue in our country and something that I think is very underappreciated in the town that I work in, which is Washington, D.C. So my grandmother, Marcia McGhee, was a social worker who worked both in the Chicago public schools and in the public housing system, including with young mothers at the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. When I told her last week that I was going to be coming to Hartford to give this speech, she said, well, honey, I think what you need to tell them is how it is that in Washington, D.C., people are so crazy. I said, I mean, I know what you mean, Grandma, and she said, well, they're working every day to try to make sure that families have a roof over their heads, and the nonsense that is going on in Washington, if they're like I was when I was working, you know, as a social worker, they don't understand. They simply don't understand how people can be that out of touch with what's going on. So thank you, Grandma Marcia. I will do my best. So here's what I'm here to do. First, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where we are, though it's early and Betsy asked me to motivate you, not depress you. And then I want to share some of my thoughts about how we got here, importantly, and then where we go from here. So you all are on the front lines of the most urgent need, the most life-changing support, and the most recently battered element in American families' lives, which is housing. I don't need to tell you what it's been like for the past few years. You know that here in Connecticut, investments in housing have dropped from $100 million a year in the late 90s to just $20 million last year, and to not a single new dollar in the governor's budget proposal. Meanwhile, there are 3 very low-income households for every 1 affordable and available rental unit, just in this state. And from a national perspective, here are just a few facts. Before welfare reform in 1996, 68 out of every 100 families in poverty received some sort of aid. In 2009, it was just 27. And now we have the highest number of people living in poverty since we started counting. Rents have risen nationally by 11% as house prices have declined by 29% just over the past 4 years. After the stock market crash and in the midst of millions of foreclosures, we have lost an epic amount of household wealth, a generation of wealth, which in the case for families of color was a loss that we simply could not afford. As we know, the racial wealth gap is where history shows up in your wallet, where historic public policies to create wealth intersect with policies to discriminate and redline, resulting in an average African American or Latino family having less than a dime of wealth for every dollar of wealth held by the average white family. And it has gotten worse. Since 2005, the median net worth of African American families has fallen by more than half, of Latino families by more than 2/3 since just 2005. Sorry, that was 2005. Half, 2/3. This is no ordinary time. This is also no ordinary time because in the midst of all this, corporate profits are actually at an all-time high. The banks and investment houses that taxpayers bailed out have returned to profitability, God bless them, at least on paper, and bonus checks that would pay rent for whole neighborhoods are being cut again on Wall Street. And in the middle of the most severe economic downturn we've seen since the Great Depression, austerity fever has taken hold of Washington. And now we're seeing federal budget cuts to match and possibly exceed the ones that cash-strapped states have had to endure, but these by cynical partisan choice. The House recently voted to reduce HUD public housing capital funding by 20% from last year, which, following a decade-long decline, would be a 60% cut from 2001 levels in inflation-adjusted terms. We know that the Super Committee is tasked with finding at least $1.2 trillion in savings from the budget for over the next decade, and that the biggest contributor to the committee's members, by far, is the rabidly anti-tax group Club for Growth. We also know that there is serious consideration in Washington of a balanced budget amendment or a permanent spending cap, which, to show its true objective, also would have a revenue cap. Both of these are little budgetary mechanisms I like to call depression makers for the effect that they would have on the federal government's ability to respond to an economic crisis. But they would also, even in non-crisis times, lock into place the uniquely ungenerous American welfare state at a time when the general welfare of our people is declining, and more fundamentally, create a permanent dominance of an economic vision that has failed American families for the past 40 years. Which takes me to how we got here. Now, for those of us born within the last 40 years, it's sometimes hard to see how it can be any different. Of course, we all have to pay banks for the privilege of our higher education, now to the tune of over $20,000 in debt over graduation. Cover story of the USA Today this morning was student loan debt surpasses $1 trillion. How could it be any different than that? Of course there's no parental or sick leave or public support for childcare for the vast majority of families. That's just the way it is. Of course there are very few rules on what a bank or broker can charge you for a mortgage or a credit card. Of course you may not get health care on the job and a secure pension. That's an anachronism. Of course only 1 out of every 3 jobs, according to our data, is a good job, paying the median wage with some benefits. And of course, CEOs pay themselves an average of 300 times the average worker. And nearly 70% of the past 5 years of income growth has gone to the top 1%. Of course. And finally, and most importantly, of course the political conversation has not been about these things or the things that keep us up at night, but it's about the size of government with a little sprinkling of any given divisive social issue of the day. But it's not, of course. And actually, and this is important to remind myself and to everyone you know who's under 40, that it was different. Some of the people in this room may remember a time when CEOs paid themselves an average of not 300 times their average worker, but 25, and contributed triple the share to our public purse as they do today. When states had caps on interest rates and fees, when the government sent folks to college on grants, not loans, helped put people into houses on affordable, sustainable loans, not exploding arms with teaser rates, and when all that a man needed to do to provide his family with a middle-class life was have a high school diploma, a union card, and a job. Now, I'm not saying that this time in American life was perfect. I stand before you as a black woman, after all. But there was a social contract in this country, and it was mutually reinforced by government, business, and labor. And this contract is what created the middle class, which I think was America's greatest invention. This contract was forged in the post-war era, and for a while, it seemed to only be improving with every decade, as more signatories to the contract were brought on, with the political liberation of African Americans, the Chicano justice movement, women's liberation movement, and even the poor by the beginning of the 1970s. But then again, more signatories were being brought on. We progressive economic types generally see 2 very starkly different eras in the latter half of 20th century. One spanning roughly from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, and then the next from the mid-1970s to today. Very different economic eras in this country. And the most vivid way to illustrate the difference is with a bar chart, which would break down the country's families into fifths by income. Because I don't actually really like to do PowerPoints when I don't have to, I'm going to use my hand. So, from the mid-1940s to the mid-1970s, let's picture that each of my fingers is 1/5 of the family's, America's income distribution. Economic growth actually looked like this, with the thumb, the poorest families, actually seeing their incomes rise faster than everybody else's. Imagine that. And now we have a more familiar picture, the growth since the mid-1970s, where the bottom 2 fingers actually fall in real terms, and in fact, you'd have to have the nail on my pinky finger, which would be the top 1%, kind of tear clean off my hand in order to really show how fast and far it's pulled away from the rest. So what happened to change our economy so much? A lot of people will say globalization, technological change, the information age, and it's true. Those things happened to bring new competition and a new premium on education. But the rules changed too. The rules changed in a big way to fundamentally shift the responsibility for paying taxes from corporations and the wealthy further on to working families. Why, just since 1980, the top tax rate on wealth and investment income have fallen by half, and it's gone up on regular paychecks by 8% through the payroll tax. The rules changed to keep the minimum wage low, losing nearly half of its purchasing power from a peak in 1968. And the rules changed to make it easier for businesses to resist unions with impunity, to ship jobs to places with cheaper labor, to dodge their taxes, and to influence our elected leaders. More on that in a moment. At the same time, the rules didn't change to keep up with the changing times in ways that would have given more families a leg up, like responding to the new premium on education with more college grants, not fewer, or responding to the necessity of two-earner households with childcare, or by providing universal health care as employers started shedding that benefit, portable pensions for the same, or a more generous unemployment insurance system in an era of easy layoffs and downsizing. So much of the shift in rules shifted power and opportunity away from working families that you just have to see something bigger here, don't you? What happened to that social contract between government, business, and workers? Well, two of the parties to that contract got up from the table and cut a side deal. That's what happened. And the impact on our policies of the explosion of the big money campaign contribution system, which surpassed $5 billion in 1 year in 2008, the professionalization of large business organizing through the Chamber of Commerce and other trade organizations in Washington, and the multiplication of lobbyists. There are now 24 lobbyists for every member of Congress. That cannot be overstated. And while not every business, not even every big business, is advancing policies that disadvantage families, I think it's important to acknowledge that. But the sum total of the flood of business cash and lobbying in Washington, honestly, it drowns out the voices of regular families on a day-to-day basis. Princeton political scientist Larry Bartels found that, and I have to just read this as a quote, "The preferences of people at the bottom third of the income distribution appear to have no apparent impact on the behavior of their elected officials." None. But something else also happened in our culture besides the change in our political process and our democracy. Why did it become so publicly acceptable to push for tax breaks at all cost, to wage war on the American government, and to demonize the class of people who in different eras were known fondly as the little guy that you used to root for? This, I believe, this change in our culture is where the increasingly unexamined role of unconscious bias comes into our public culture in ways that are destroying opportunity for all of us. Now, the human brain naturally categorizes objects and people and ideas. It's actually part of our great intelligence, right? And it naturally takes shortcuts to fill in those categories. That red round thing on the table is an apple, and apples are apples, whether they're Fiji or Macintosh. And that orange round thing on the table is an orange, and oranges are oranges, whether it's Mandarin or navel, and apples are sweet, and oranges are tart. And so it's natural for us to categorize people as well by their physical characteristics, what we see, and to go beyond that to find shortcuts to give meaningful attribute to those categories. That's what our brain does. The unconscious mind is working all of the time. In fact, there's sort of a pyramid. If you look at sort of how many conscious thoughts we have, the share of how many unconscious thoughts and connections that we're making dwarfs it entirely. So the problem is that our society has been so hierarchical along the lines of physical attribution, race, gender, age, apparent sexuality, that the shortcuts that we are constantly primed in our society to make have unequal consequences. Studies of implicit bias out of Harvard University, where you're asked to quickly associate words with faces, demonstrate that we are all, nearly universally, less able to associate quickly darker faces with positive words, though white respondents do find it more difficult than non-whites to do that quick association. All this is to say, It's okay. It's understandable. We all have it. I mean, it's not okay, but it is understandable. Right? We are, in this country, a great multiracial experiment. We have to take that as a point of pride. No other democracy in the world has tried to do what we've tried to do, which is have a room that looks like this and say, okay, we all get an equal say. We have to take that as a point of pride in this country. And if we take it as a point of pride in this country, we acknowledge the difficulties of it and work towards it every single day. And unfortunately, what we have instead, particularly in the past 20 years, I would say, is this imperative to be colorblind, to not talk about race, to not acknowledge difference. And unfortunately, that has meant that people of good intentions, like the people in this room, do their work every single day in ways that obviously show the impact of racial inequality without talking about it in those terms, while people with not good intentions send coded messages every single day to further divide us. And then, of course, there are people who are just plain racist, right? So I want to read a quote from Lee Atwater, who's the architect of the Southern strategy that massively shifted the political alignment in this country at just around the same time period when our economic fortunes began to shift. So excuse my language as I read this quote verbatim, but I think it's important. I'm not going to fake a Southern accent because you heard me try to do my grandma, right? So you start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, right? This is a political strategist, Lee Atwater. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're really talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that's a part of it. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that if it's getting that abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. When I think about that time when Henry Ford and President Eisenhower and the UAW president Walter Reuther signed that fictional contract together, picture those three men. I feel like it was easier for them to feel like they were sitting across the table from their brother when they signed that contract. And you're a lot more likely to want to invest in your brother, to share your rewards with your brother, to lift the floor to help out your brother, to pay him $5 a day. But now there are more signatories to that contract, and we don't all look alike, and it's hard. And those other industrialized nations like France and Germany that are spending 25% of their GDP on social benefits as opposed to our 16% on social benefits, they've never had our diversity historically, and now they're struggling too. I'm not saying this is easy, but it's impossible if you don't acknowledge it. And in fact, our lack of a social contract is destroying all of us for many reasons. It makes people less willing to support the public when there is anxiety about who the public is. The right wing has exploited that anxiety for a 30-year sustained attack on government and taxes, and look where we are now. It allows policies and practices that start out targeting communities of color, like subprime lending, to flourish unchecked. We all know how hard it was for decades trying to convince Congress to do something about predatory lending when it was just an issue in certain neighborhoods and certain communities. And look where we are now. So it hurts all of us. When we have this massive shift from working and middle-class families' incomes to the very top, it actually hurts our economic growth. For a long time, people didn't really see that connection. They thought inequality was the byproduct of the fast economic growth. But in fact, it's the opposite. Now here's the good news. We can fix it. We can mend our social contract. We can come together. We can stop pitting the middle class against the working class and the working class against the poor. And we can inspire a new spirit of deep patriotism in this country that takes in all of the people who are here on the most beautiful land on God's green earth and say that we all deserve a dignified, decent life. We can do that. We can change the conversation around taxes from punishing the job creators to saying that to whomever much is given, of him much will be required. That means we can, instead of giving today's billionaires six-figure tax handouts, we can give tomorrow's leaders the $5,000 college grants that could change their lives. And to do that, we have to and we can start seeing the yellow, brown, and black young people who will make our country majority-minority in just a few short decades, not as harbingers of some great American decline, but as the future middle class in whom we can invest the way our grandparents invested in us to renew our country's greatest accomplishment. Can we do that? Can we do that? I mean, if I had written this speech 6 weeks ago, it would have ended a little bit more depressed. Parts of this conversation, parts of this transformation are already beginning. By bringing back the tactic of civil demonstration and then staying there, the young protesters at Zuccotti Park have made the space for so many of us, so many more of us, who are not going to go and sleep out in tents and sleeping bags in a public park, have made the space for us to talk about the stress on family budgets, not just projections of the federal budget. Last weekend, over 900 communities across the globe moved to protest over economic inequality. That's according to the Washington Post. And here in the US, a 20-plank list of demands has emerged. And the first 4 on the list call for really fundamental restructurings of our democracy, which I think is very important, and changes to our campaign contributions. But you'll be glad to know that 3 of those 20 demands deal with solving the foreclosure crisis and expanding affordable housing in this country. But I'm not here actually to stomp for Occupy Wall Street or We Are the 99%, heavens no. What I'm here to do is to invite you to let that transformational spirit occupy you. Let it occupy your hearts and move your bodies into action. Many of you have made careers starting and maintaining programs, piecing together funding, come as it may, navigating the maze of the system to bring real relief and hope to thousands of Connecticut families. But so often the good work that you do can be undermined, in fact, can be overwhelmed by a national conversation and shifts in the rules and in the loci of power. So I ask you to seize this moment, to do something uncomfortable. Don't accept the status quo and try to protect as many families as you can, as tempting as that is, because the status quo is not acceptable. Remind young people particularly that it doesn't have to be this way, and that in fact our democracy means that together we write the rules that shape individual opportunity. We have the policy ideas on housing, on putting Americans directly back to work. Demos did an analysis last year which we found that you could directly put Americans back to work, $8 million for less than the annual cost of the Bush tax cuts. We have the policy ideas on transportation and development. I know you do. What we lack, what we have lacked, is the political power to lift the expectations of what our government can and should do. It's not a question of the size of government. It's a question of who government is working for. So you all know in the work that you can do, whether you're a private real estate developer, a tenant in public housing, a coordinator of affordable housing networks across the state, you all know what public policy can do to change people's lives for the better. Please, let us not let this conversation get hijacked to feel like government is the enemy, to feel like this decline in our living standards is inevitable, to feel like we are strangers to one another and not a beautiful, difficult democracy with every color in the rainbow in it. I'm so privileged and honored to have been with you today, and I'm so inspired by what you're doing every single day. And I just want to ask you to join with me, do something uncomfortable, do something transformational, do something for the future, and do something for the state of Connecticut. Thank you. Minutes for questions, and I'll put my glasses back on. I think someone has a microphone. Is that right? Yes. Okay. Yeah, you can just stand up and shout. You could read the quote again. Sure. My goodness. Well, you know what? I will, and I think it's important because I do think that the rapidity and the ferocity of our transition from recovery to cuts is something that is not fully explained without a sense of the racial undertones of taxes and spending in this country, particularly with our first black president. And that, in fact, when we ignore that, it doesn't make sense when we see such popular resistance to public policies that could help us all, right? So, this is Lee Atwater. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say that. It hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, from forced busing to cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that. Lee Atwater's not saying that. But I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we are doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. Someone's got to give me a more uplifting question than that. So you can just stand up and shout, I think, or if there's someone with a... Yes.
Thank you. And beautiful speech. I agree with it 1,000%, the whole perspective. But right now, we're talking about what you focused on was partially the governmental impact on society.
Mm-hmm.
But the corporations don't have the same sense of pride that we have in Connecticut and the United States. Mm-hmm. What can we do to help encourage our corporations to remember that they're based here in America too,
right,
and not, to uplift the rest of the world at our expense?
So I think, did everyone hear the question? It was basically, so no, I'm getting no's in the back. Basically, the question was, what can we do to encourage corporations to have the same sense of patriotism and sense of desire to invest in America? And Larry, I think, lifted up that that's happening more in Connecticut, but perhaps at a national level, it's not. I agree. I think we need a fundamentally different, conversation around corporate responsibility, which is not so much that, it's sort of a noblesse oblige, but rather just pointing out, as a friend of mine, Elizabeth Warren, said very well and eloquently, more so than I can, that in fact nobody in this country, and certainly no corporation in this country, gets rich on their own. That in fact the investments that we publicly have made, that our grandparents made, that we make every single day, are what, you know, provide the roads for corporations to transport their goods, provide the educated workers that both are the workers and the consumers of their goods, that provide the legal system that enforces their contract, that provides the financial markets that allow them to aggregate wealth. I mean, this is not a, as the president said in his speech, a sort of situation where we can all just take our money back and go home. And in fact, if we can see, and I really do believe that so much of it has to be in terms of the conversation about seeing ourselves as part of a single family, so that of course we should want to invest in our future and in our children and in our community and in our well-being. And then there are some things we can do to sort of, other than just changing the conversation, to actually make sure that there are worker voices on corporate boards, that there are, there's more accountability around corporate charters. There's actually a lot we can do, and certainly starting by overturning Citizens United to make sure that corporations don't have quite the same influence that they have on our political process as that they've now been unleashed to do is a big part of it. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, I'm going to try the mic. My name's Steve. I work at Neighborhood Housing Services of New Haven. And this morning my daughter asked me to, and actually last night, she's writing a paper, senior in high school, about what's going on in New York right now. And my wife, who's a social worker, said, well, you know, suggested that there's 3 stages to either these movements. And one is awareness. The next one is acceptance, and the third one is action. Mm-hmm. And so I really thank you this morning to really help us with this awareness, and I think you're really codifying some of the details of that. So my question to you is, and I really like the analogy of the fingers and how you move that. So my question is let's not focus on sort of the top finger or the bottom 2, but the 2 in the middle. Mm-hmm. And I think what the argument is that there's this myth that people can get to that 1% or the top 10%. So I think that's where the myth lies, I think, a little bit. And I was wondering if what I'm saying makes any sense to you, or if you have any comment on that. Thanks.
It certainly does. There's a wonderful speech by Robert Kennedy. I think it was actually it was a Yale commencement speech, New Haven, where he talks about the great problem in our society. I mean, this is a terrible paraphrase, but the great problem in our society not being the lies that we perpetuate, but the myths. And it is true that the myths of American mobility has been, for many people, part of the cultural resistance to really recognizing and working against the incredible levels of economic inequality that we've tolerated for the past 40 years in this country. I think that is shifting, and it is shifting because, you know, in my field, in progressive economics, there was a real debate over the past 15 years about whether economic inequality actually mattered. The book that I co-wrote a chapter on, we had a conference on it, it was called Inequality Matters, because we had to argue that, right? Because there was this idea, well, maybe it doesn't matter so much if people are able to become millionaires and billionaires like they weren't before. The benefits will trickle down, right? That is in and of itself maybe not a problem. But what you're seeing now is an awakening to the declining living standards for the middle income families and the working class families, the aspiring middle class. And I think it's very simple. I mean, basically over those 40 years that I talk about, first women went into the workforce, right? So suddenly you could do 2 paychecks. So that eased the sort of perception of the decline of living standards. Then we had the debt bubble, right, where people were giving themselves the raise that they weren't getting on work by tripling the amount of credit card debt in this country, which is something that Demos worked quite a bit on, or by using their houses as ATMs, right? So we've been able in this country to ignore the unraveling of the social contract and its effect on our economic vitality and diversity for a long time, and we're simply unable to ignore it anymore. So I think you're right that it does, that the sort of creeping up of economic insecurity is making for an important political flashpoint. I don't want us to forget, however, how much more painful it is to be a family with no savings and no income than it is to be a formerly suburban middle-class family that's declining. And I know that you all don't forget that at all, but I do worry a little bit as we start to sort of broaden the conversation around economic insecurity that the neighborhoods and the families that have been struggling, that have been in depression levels of unemployment for decades, will get lost in the policy solutions if we don't cohere and find ourselves as the 99%, not the middle class versus the working class versus the poor as we've done for so long. So unfortunately, I have to get that one train that leaves Hartford and goes to New York before the end of the day because I have a board meeting from my organization today at 3 o'clock. The website for my organization is www.demos.org. And I really wish that I could stay with you all and learn more about what's going on in Connecticut and housing. And I really do invite you to contact me. My email address is on the website, and to engage with my organization about these sort of larger questions, to lift your voices, to keep doing the work to protect the families here in Connecticut, but to also lift your voices and do one or two things that you wouldn't have done before to make a difference. So thank you.